I've watched the film from Falcons Bengals, and we're breaking down which Falcons players played well enough to stake their claim on one of the team's 53 roster spots.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
So, guys, welcome back to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by BetterHelp. If you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try by visiting betterhelp.com/lockedon today, and you'll get 10% off your first month. And so, guys, you know me as Aaron Freeman, your very humble host of this illustrious podcast, and you might also know me as Sirius Black. You might also know me as Mr. Drew. My friends call me Negative Nancy, but you can call me Mr. Drew. But you can become a friend by becoming an everydayer and do what they do by subscribing and following for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So on today's episode, we are talking more roster stuff. I've watched the All 22 on Sunday morning from the Falcons Bengals preseason game. My opinions basically on the starters really didn't change. So if you wanted to get my thoughts on that, I kind of gave those on the previous episode on Saturday. So you can go back and listen to that if you want to get in-depth insights. But basically, like, to me, nothing really changed watching the film in terms of what I thought, on Desmond Ridder, the offense, the defense, etc. So, I think today it'd be at least more interesting to me, maybe not to you, right? But to talk about some of the guys that did sort of stand out on film that I think did help themselves on this Friday night to make the roster. And right now, we'll probably get into this a little bit later this week, tentatively on Wednesday, where we'll probably be joined by Kevin Knight of the Falcoholic to go in depth on sort of who we think ahead of the Steeler game is going to meet that 53-man roster. But right now, I'm sort of feeling like I feel pretty good about 49 of the 53 guys that I think are going to make it, right? And like the last four spots really just come down to that fifth wide receiver, 3 out of the 4 backup offensive linemen. I feel pretty good that Ryan Nuzzo is going to be one of those 4 backup linemen. The other 3 I kind of have no idea about. And, we'll talk about some of the guys that helped themselves, potentially be one of those 3 offensive linemen, as well as the wide receiver position a little bit later on today's episode. But when we look at this roster, even though I wouldn't say there's 49 locks to make the roster at this point in time, like if you're asking me who's a lock, meaning, who's got a over 99% chance of making or being on the team week 1, assuming that they're healthy, I feel like there's maybe like 38 locks at this point in time. And the difference between that 38 number and the 49 number, those 11 guys, I would probably say most of those guys are somewhere between like an 80 to 95% chance of making the roster, assuming they're healthy. So I have a relatively high degree of confidence that those 11 guys will be on the team, but I won't call them locks at this point in time. But 2 guys that I think definitely on Friday night against the Bengals, after reviewing the film, basically jumped into that 11-man group of guys that are now like 80+% chance of making the roster, are Godwin Igwebuike and DeMarcco Hellams. And it reminds me a little bit of like that Key and Peele sketch where, it was the Gremlins 2 sequel doctor, and he was, talking to the various writers around the table. And he's like, "Oh, you're talking about a googly eye gremlin? I don't know what you're talking about. You're a crazy person, but who cares? It's in the movie." And like, I feel like with Godwin Igwebuike, you're talking about a running back, who's only spent this is only his second year playing running back after spending his entire career playing safety. But despite that, shows the balance, the vision, the speed, the burst to maximize his yardage on each run in this outside zone scheme that also can return kicks and also holds his own in pass protection. Yes, I don't care. He's in the movie. He's on the team. Right? DeMarcco Hellams, like, you're telling me you're going to put this physical run thumping box safety that also has enough ball skills and awareness and coverage that he can jump throwing lanes and pick off passes in back-to-back games. Yes, even though he's a third string safety, he's on the team. He's in the movie. Right. And so like Igwebuike, to me, as we mentioned before, like, I feel like his status in terms of whether or not he's a lock to make the team or not is heavily tied towards Cordarrelle Patterson's status in week 1, right? If CP's currently dealing with that soft tissue injury, we don't know exactly what it is. Let's just, for the sake of assumptions, assume it's a hamstring, right? I think the Falcons can kind of afford to slow play whatever that issue is with CP, given his age, given his past history of struggling to stay healthy for a full season, and given the fact that the Falcons have other options at the running back position, namely Bijan Robinson and Tyler Algier. I don't think the Falcons have to feel compelled to have to rush him back. And I also think because Igwebuike has shown that if need be, he can be productive in this offense. If we need to get to a third running back, he can step in and be okay. And so that's why I would put Igwebuike, among that 49 guys that I feel like are pretty good bets to make the roster. With Hellams, he's probably the 5th safety at this point. And I think the status of the cornerback room is going to potentially impact that safety group, right? Because given that 2 out of our potential 6 corners, that I'm currently projecting to be on the roster this year might not be healthy week 1. That's Jeff Okudah and Mike Hughes. That may push the Falcons to keep a 7th cornerback, right? And I said, I think on Saturday's episode, that I don't think they will keep a 7th corner, but in rethinking it now, I'm like, maybe they will, right? And, going into the summer, I was like, they'll probably keep 7, but no, again. But I think most of it is due to the fact that if they only keep 6 and Okudah and Hughes aren't healthy for week 1, that will only give them 4 healthy corners on the active roster come week 1 against Carolina. And I think that's doable given, we can play some dime, we can play some big nickel with Richie Grant or something like that, sort of dabbling as a corner as well, to sort of compensate for that. But, in the 2 years that Arthur Smith has been here, we have not had less than 5 active corners on game day at any point in those 2 years, right? And you can go back like 4 or 5 years, and it's very rare to have less than 5 active corners on game day for this Falcons team. And so, if them keeping a 5th safety may depend on Hughes being healthy come week 1. And instead that roster spot may go to a 7th corner if Hughes is not healthy, is basically what I'm saying. But if you're wondering, why is Hellams the 5th safety and not the 4th safety? Because Micah Abernathy appears to be the 4th guy. And the main reason for that is he's consistently throughout training camp practices and in the last 2 games has been getting that second team work, with Jalen Hawkins at the safety position, right? That was true on Friday night against the Bengals. He's also the personal protector on the punt team and has served that role for 7 out of the 8 punts that the Falcons have had this preseason. And so unless the Falcons are going to throw us a curveball and basically bring in someone completely new to play that personal protector role on the punt coverage team, and that player doesn't play safety, and typically in the NFL, those players tend to be running backs and safeties. So this could also theoretically, if the Falcons decided to throw that curveball, could also affect Godwin Igwebuike's status. But, unless the Falcons fully plan to even though Micah Abernathy's getting all the snaps at personal protector, we're going to get a brand new personal protector. Because again, it's clear that the Falcons aren't training anybody else currently on the team to be that guy come week 1. Again, unless they throw a major curveball on Thursday night against the Steelers. So it feels like Abernathy's relatively safe compared to a player like Hellams. But I do think Hellams definitely helped himself and made the case where the Falcons have to figure out a way to keep 5 safeties. And maybe that means, keeping a 7th corner, or maybe that means keeping 1 less offensive lineman. Again, that's the roster math that the Falcons are going to have to figure out between now and September 13th when the regular season kicks off. So we'll see how that goes. But I think in addition to those 2 guys that I think made the jump to the roster, I think several other guys helped themselves going into this final preseason Steeler game that, now they're potentially front runners for a practice squad spot, and may, if they can build off of what they did against Cincinnati, be in a position where they could also land on a roster. And we'll break down those guys as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. Today's episode is sponsored by BetterHelp, and you've heard me talk before about how therapy has benefited me over the past year, and that's thanks to BetterHelp. Therapy has helped me understand that I can control what I can control, and that's indirectly helped me not only in my personal life, but also professionally here, and I think making this podcast better. And sometimes in life, we're faced with tough choices, right? And the path forward is not always clear. whether you're dealing with decisions that are dealing with your career, your relationships, or anything else. I think therapy can help you stay connected with what you really want while you navigate through life, and you can move forward with confidence and excitement. And if you're thinking about starting therapy, I cannot recommend BetterHelp enough. It has helped me tremendously. It's done entirely online. It's designed to be convenient and flexible and suited to your schedule. You can just fill out a brief questionnaire. You'll get matched with a licensed therapist very quickly. And then you can even switch therapists at any point for no additional charge. So let therapy be your map with BetterHelp. Visit betterhelp.com/lockedon today, and you'll get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/lockedon. So continuing today's Locked On Falcons, before we get into, who helped themselves and when we're talking about all this roster stuff, we have a tendency to focus too much on the quote unquote the final roster, or more accurately, the initial 53-man roster, right? As if it's something that's set in stone. And it is worth noting that I think, we look back to last year, there were several players that didn't necessarily survive final cuts, but did wind up playing, significant roles or regular roles with the team throughout the 2022 season. That includes players like running back Caleb Huntley, tight end Michael Pruitt, tight end Anthony Ferkser, defensive tackle Abdullah Anderson, linebacker Nick Kwiatkowski. And so even though we're going to sit here over the next 10 days between now and that August 29th final cuts, and then August 30th with the practice squad being established, we're going to talk about who makes it and who doesn't make it. It's all very fluid, right? And then there's 10 days after that point between when we can establish the roster and the practice squad, that initial roster at least, and who the Falcons are actually going to put on the field come week one, for the very first time. So there will be a lot of moves basically over the next 3 weeks between that point today and that point. So we'll just sort of see how that goes. But, that being said, let's talk about who helped themselves against the Bengals, and I think put themselves at least at the potential front of the line for some roster spots, and primarily practice squad spots, right? Because again, I still think there's only a handful of roster spots that are really up for grabs at this point in time. But let's talk about the offensive line, which, as I mentioned earlier, is probably the most fluid of this group from a roster standpoint. And rewatching the film, I thought Tyler Vrabel played very well. He was arguably the second best offensive tackle besides Jake Matthews in that Cincinnati game. And I think they both had identical PFF grades as the highest graded offensive lineman for the team. So clearly the film didn't necessarily lie upon rewatch. And I think that's notable, at least for me personally, with Tyler Vrabel, because I've been kind of dismissive of him ever since he's gotten here. Like, I didn't really think much of him at Boston College. I didn't really think much of him in his first summer here. I didn't really think of much of him in that first preseason game this year against the Dolphins. And like I previously joked last year that like the only reason he's here is because his last name is Vrabel, and Mike Vrabel, his dad, is Arthur Smith's BFF. But I think Vrabel deserves credit. He looked really solid against the Bengals, and this is the first time in basically over a year where I'm like, oh, Tyler Vrabel can actually play good football, and he's not just here because of his name. Okay, nepotism, and it's not just nepotism. So credit to him. He was one of the few standout Falcons offensive linemen in that Cincinnati game. It was not a great night for the Falcons offensive line. So the question now is like, is he now swing tackle material? I would be like, pump the brakes. Like, one good game, I'm not going to necessarily anoint you as a swing tackle. And then also coupled with, it's one thing to hold your own against, the Bengals' second and third string defensive ends. It's another thing to do that against Danielle Hunter and Rashawn Gary and Shaq Barrett and Montez Sweat, et cetera. If and when, that swing tackle has to step into the starting lineup for an injured Jake Matthews or Caleb McGarry. And that's the same goes for Josh Miles, who I also thought played pretty well against the Bengals and looked better on Friday than he did the previous week against the Dolphins. And so to me, before we talk about any of those guys being swing tackles, we need to see them carry that momentum and also have better, equally as good, if not better games against the Steelers before we can entertain the idea of either one of those guys at that swing tackle position. But as of today, before I don't think I probably had Tyler Vrabel on my practice squad, and today I would probably put him on my projected practice squad. I'd probably still lean more towards Josh Miles as the roster guy. But I think at this point it's a coin flip, and that's certainly something that I wouldn't have thought if you had asked me about that, 72 hours ago, before that Bengals game. And talking about other players I think really helped themselves in that Bengals game, cornerback Natrone Brooks I think is another player. We got to see him this week. Against Miami he played primarily in the slot. This week he played primarily outside. And while you could still see, he's not a great matchup against bigger receivers like Bengals rookie receiver Andre Yeshivas, who's 6'3", and Brooks is like 5'10". That size disparity did kind of impact him and led to some issues. I thought the fact that Brooks was very competitive against the bigger wide receiver showed me something. And, he made some plays last week in the slot. He made some plays this week on the outside. And I think that versatility makes him a lot more valuable than some of the other guys that, may just only be a slot only guy or only an outside corner. And so that's going to be something valuable, probably more on practice squad than necessarily the roster, just because of how many bodies we have at that quarterback position. But we'll see. Again, the health issues of Okudah and Hughes may help a player like Brooks, especially if he can build off of this Bengals game against the Steelers. Another player on defense was linebacker Andre Smith. Sorry. If you had asked me after the Miami Dolphins game, I would have put him on the short list of players like, there's no chance he's making the roster, right? Because usually the guys that only play in the fourth quarter of the first preseason game, like they're the team is kind of telling you that they haven't really done enough in practice in camp so far to tell us. But I think in light of Michael Walker's release, and the fact that Smith made several plays in that Cincinnati game, I do think because of the more turmoil that we have now in the back end of the linebacker position, he is now a legit contender at this point in time. And I feel like we probably know who the four linebackers are going to be. It's going to be Troy Anderson. It's going to be Caden Ellis. It's going to be Nate Landman and probably Tay Davis at this point in time. Again, Landman and Davis are probably in that 11 group of like non-locks, but like pretty safe bets at this point in time. I think with Andre Smith, he's still limited in terms of his speed and coverage, right? And so that makes him a questionable fit on defense, but he's a force against the run. He showed that against Cincinnati. And the fact that he does have experience playing on special teams with other teams, I think does help him potentially make a practice squad spot. And he's sort of competing with Mike Jones Jr. as well as Frank Ginda for, one or two practice squad spots, I think, at this point in time. But we'll see. Maybe he can build off of it against the Steelers game and maybe make a legit case that maybe we should keep 5 linebackers, or maybe, one of those 4 instead of Tay Davis, maybe it's Andre Smith. Who knows? The last player I'll point out before we move on is defensive tackle LaCale London. After the Miami game, it felt like it was very clearly Timmy Horn and Albert Huggins, and then there was like a big drop off for the rest of the D tackle group. But I think both of those guys were pretty quiet, Huggins and Horn, that is, against the Bengals. And I think London played well enough that he kind of closed the gap on those. So I think it's more of a 3-man race. And the fact that he's a little bit more of a thumper, a run defender in the middle of the defense, I think that's something the Falcons need, especially in light of Eddie Goldman's retirement, where, you want to have that guy that can contribute on early downs so that you can save Grady Jarrett and David Onyemata and all those guys for passing situations where they're most valuable. And so I think London showing that he can be a force against the run helped his case. Now, there is one other player I do want to talk about. That is wide receiver JJ Arcega-Whiteside, but we'll talk more about him as well as the rest of the wide receiver group, because we have a little bit more clarity about the injury statuses of wide receivers KhaDarel Hodge and Penny Hart coming out of this Bengals game, and we'll get into all of that as we wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. So we're very close to football season kicking off, and FanDuel is giving you a chance to win all season long, because right now, if you bet on a Super Bowl winner, you will get bonus bets back every time they win in the regular season. Just pick any team to win the Super Bowl. You'll get bonus bets after every victory. You can use those bonus bets on spreads and player props, including Bijan Robinson, Offensive Rookie of the Year. His performance on Friday night against the Bengals didn't really move the needle in terms of his odds, but he's still the overwhelming favorite at plus 300. You can also use over unders as well as every other thing. The Falcons Super Bowl odds currently are plus 5,500. That means if you bet $200 for the Falcons to win Super Bowl, you can win up to $11,000 in February. But between now and then, you will get bonus bets back every time the Falcons win this year. So visit FanDuel.com/lockedon, and you'll start earning those bonus bets back with America's #1 sportsbook. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon. So we did get an update on Sunday from the two major injuries coming out of that Cincinnati game. And Arthur Smith, Falcons head coach, of course, said that KhaDarel Hodge is dealing with an ankle injury and Penny Hart is in the concussion protocol. And both of those guys will be held out of practice all week long. So we can already rule them out of playing that Steelers game. And we always talk about how unforthcoming Arthur Smith is with injury information. So this leads us to put on a little bit of our tinfoil hats and speculate a little bit about what these injuries could be. The fact that Hodge was already ruled out for a week to me suggests that it's more of a multi-week injury rather than just a week. He'll be back next week. We'll see. But like you remember when Clark Phillips went down in the joint practices, he was considered day to day, and he got hurt I think on a Wednesday, and he was back practicing on Sunday. Right? If KhaDarel Hodge was ready, probably going to be ready to go on next week in practice, he probably would have said day to day. We wouldn't have said he's definitely out this week, right? So I think the concern with KhaDarel Hodge, based off of how he got injured, it looked very similar to how Patrick Mahomes suffered a high ankle sprain, and that's the concern that I have personally with KhaDarel Hodge, and it's a similar issue to what we're worried about with Jeff Okudah, right? And as we discussed when Jeff Okudah went down in practice, that's an infamous injury because there's no real firm timetable on how long that takes for a player to heal, right? Some player, Mahomes played on his high ankle sprain, obviously different circumstances, but some players come back in like 2 or 3 weeks. Some players take like 10 weeks to come back from a high ankle sprain. And so it's hard to know with that. And so when we're reading into things, to me, it doesn't sound optimistic that we'll see KhaDarel Hodge week 1. That's going to have potential impact on special teams units and whatnot. That's going to help some of these wide receivers, potentially make the roster, to fill in those special teams role. It also means that maybe potentially, again, we're speculating purely here. We say if KhaDarel Hodge is a multi-month long injury, misses say 4 to 6 weeks, there's a potential that he could start the season on the short-term IR. And as a reminder, short-term IR, you've got to miss a minimum 4 weeks. And as we've noted before, you can only be eligible for the short-term IR if you are put on IR after the final cuts on August 29th. And so to me, I think that both applies to not only KhaDarel Hodge, but potentially Jeff Okudah. Hopefully, Penny Hart will clear the concussion protocol by next week or whatever, and we'll see how that affects his status when it comes to making the roster, but we'll see about that. So, I'm not as concerned with Hart, should he be on the team, not being able to play week 1. Same thing goes with Cordarrelle Patterson and Mike Hughes and Taquan Graham and all those other guys that are, missing time currently at practice. But we're just kind of fumbling around in the dark when it comes to this injury information. But it does, as I mentioned earlier, it does potentially impact the wide receiver depth position. And no, I'm not going to talk about Corey Davis today, although I will drop his name. This injury hurts KhaDarel Hodge, but it does potentially help Scotty Miller, who we discussed with Mike Rothstein last week of ESPN, about Scotty Miller not necessarily being a lock. And so I put Scotty Miller, I went into the summer thinking he was a lock to make the roster, like a 98% chance. Now I'd probably say it falls to 88% chance or something like that. So he's not a lock, but he is in that sort of 11 guys that I mentioned earlier that, I think are pretty safe bets, but aren't necessarily locks at this point in time. Because you go in that Cincinnati game, Hodge was essentially the third wide receiver in that game. Miller was the fourth wide receiver. Josh Ali kind of was the fifth wide receiver because he was the first guy other than those two to get work with the starters with Desmond Ridder on an opening drive. And, I know Arthur Smith hates numbering wide receivers, but he's on an island there, right? Not Caleb McGarry Island, but he's on an island there like everybody else numbers that. So, I think if Hodge is, out for any significant amount of time, you would assume Miller goes up to 3. Does that make Ali 4? Yeah, maybe, potentially, who knows? But I think the wide receiver position is a toss up at this point in time. And so that, allows players to help themselves this week against Pittsburgh. But, a player that did help himself against Cincinnati, I think was JJ Arcega-Whiteside. Against Miami, I said I think Zay Malone was probably the guy that probably helped himself the most coming out of that game. I would say JJ Arcega-Whiteside. I just love saying Arcega. It probably was the guy that helped himself the most against Cincinnati. But that whole wide receiver group is just a cluster of guys. Again, I feel like there's it's London, Hollins, Hodge, a healthy Hodge, then Scotty Miller, and then there's kind of a drop off, and then there's just like a cluster of guys, and Josh Ali and JJ Arcega-Whiteside and all those guys, and are all kind of jumbled together, right? And if you push came to shove, I would probably say, just based off of how limited opportunities they've had over the last 2 preseason games, I'd probably put Slade Bolden and Keelan Harris at the bottom of that totem pole. But for all we know, against the Steelers, in the fourth quarter, they'll take advantage of their what limited opportunities they have and ball out, and all of a sudden it'll be, they'll be pushed to the front of the line potentially. That's how sort of clustered it is. And I think with JJ Arcega-Whiteside, who had that one big catch that was almost a touchdown, I think going into the summer, I just kind of dismissed him, sort of as like this year's Geronimo Allison, as a guy that has name recognition. And so that maybe led people thinking he has a better chance of making the roster than he actually does. But he was just more of a camp body in all likelihood. And I thought several other guys like Josh Ali and Penny Hart and Frank Darby and others probably had a better chance of making the roster. But I do think he did help himself against the Bengals, especially with that one big catch he had. And again, given all the turmoil at that wide receiver position, it's really anybody's game. Just, put all the names in a hat, pick one, and you're just as likely as anybody else to guess who, I think we'll probably keep 5 receivers on the roster. And again, who knows if Hodge is one of those 5, given his injury status. And then there's probably going to be like 3 practice squad guys. Like, I think they'll probably roughly have like 8 receivers ready to go, throughout practice this year, this season, in, give or take 1 or 2 each week when they have to reshuffle the roster because, they got an injured D tackle or they got an injured safety or whatever, and all that stuff all the week-to-week roster management that goes on with that stuff. But generally, I think, most weeks we'll have 8 receivers ready to go, 5 on the roster, 3 on the practice squad. So I think JJ Arcega-Whiteside right now, I'd probably put more on the practice squad at this point in time, but we'll just have to wait and see what clarity we get on not only Hodge and Penny Hart, but, who else sort of steps up against the Steeler team. And so the wide receiver group, as well as the offensive line depth, are going to be probably, as I mentioned earlier, because those are the most unsettled positions, in my opinion, going into this final preseason game. Those are going to be the positions that I'm probably most focused on come Thursday night against the Steelers. But, as I suggested earlier, there's still a lot of stuff up for grabs. And certainly I think the practice squad is still very much, throwing darts at the board in terms of who could step up and who stands out in that regard. So we'll see how that all plays out. Tomorrow's episode, I believe, we'll be joined by Dave Choate of the Falcoholic, and we'll get his thoughts on what he saw from the starters against the Cincinnati Bengals, as well as what other, roster thoughts he may have at this point in time and his expectations for the Falcons headed into the season at this point in time. So that may be something to look forward to on tomorrow's episode. As your first listen, continue to make this podcast your first listen by checking us out on YouTube or wherever you get your podcast. For your second listen, of course, you should check out the Locked On NFL podcast. A lot of stuff going on around the NFL. Get caught up on all of the weekend's action by checking out the Locked On NFL podcast. It's all part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And you got to check out Locked On Jets to find out the latest on Corey Davis. I know I am.